Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this edition of Defense News Weekly, we'll hear directly from Pentagon leaders about a new Space Force and then see them defend it on Capitol Hill. We'll also talk to two of the Army's senior leaders who are leading the charge on transforming the service. With in-depth interviews, up-close video, and leading analysis. This is Defense News Weekly. Welcome to this week's edition of Defense News Weekly. I'm Jeff Martin. Before we get into some of the details about a new Space Force or the Army's transformation, here's a look at some headlines. The Japanese Air Self-Defense Force has confirmed that one of their F-35s crashed and that some debris has been recovered. The pilot remains missing and a search is ongoing. Contact was reportedly lost about 85 miles east of Misawa Air Base over the Pacific Ocean. The JASDF has identified the aircraft as the first one to be assembled in Japan and have grounded all other Japanese F-35s. We'll keep you updated as we learn more. The Air Force is preparing to restart acceptance of KC-46 tankers from Boeing after foreign object debris, or FOD, issues have stopped deliveries twice this year. The service's acquisition chief, Dr. Will Roper, told reporters that all aircraft, including those already delivered to the Air Force, will have to be thoroughly examined, including draining the fuel tanks so personnel can hand check them for debris. If all goes well, 2 more aircraft could be delivered next week. And the Navy's top acquisition priority, the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine, which would replace Ohio-class submarines, is facing possible delays as the Navy is placing pressure on a tenuous submarine supply chain. While the Navy has downplayed concerns, they've also decided to speed up attack submarine procurement, meaning that the submarine supply base is facing its highest workload in a long time, which has the potential to slow everything down. And Air Force General John Hyten has been nominated as the new Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If confirmed, he'll leave his job as commander of the U.S. Strategic Command and head to Washington. Hyten is one of the leading space officers in the entire military and has been a top advocate of both enhanced space capabilities and a modernized nuclear triad. He'll succeed Air Force General Paul Selva, who's set to retire later this year. This week was the 35th annual Space Symposium out in Colorado Springs, Colorado. While there, senior Pentagon leaders laid out a vision for a Space Force and why it's needed. They also gave a look at the internal debate still raging about what exactly the military's space strategy should look like. Here's a look at some highlights.
Both China and Russia have weaponized space with the intent to hold American space capabilities at risk. China's communist government has exercised and continues to develop the capability to jam, targeting SATCOM, ISR, and GPS. The PLA is also deploying directed energy weapons, and we expect them to field a ground-based laser system aimed at low Earth orbit space sensors by next year.
The United States Air Force is funding the development of low Earth orbit systems and commercially based systems for some of our missions. But launching hundreds of cheap satellites a year as a substitute for the complex architectures where we provide capabilities to the warfighter will result in failure on America's worst day if we rely upon them alone. The analysis shows that clearly. Our responsibility is to provide the President options during all phases of conflict so that America continues to dominate in space.
And as Acting Secretary Shanahan properly stated, since Desert Storm, they've studied our ways and invested in means to deny us access to space capabilities in crisis or conflict. Our job is to never let that happen, so we can maintain space as a peaceful domain where common interests can align and flourish. Our president is leading the discussion. The vice president has resurrected the National Space Council that lay dormant for years. Congress is debating the future of space. Industry is energized as space becomes a place for profit and competition. And our allies and partners are talking about it, highlighted by our Air Chief Conference this week. This is an exciting time to be an airman who is passionate about space superiority.
Shortly after the symposium, some of those leaders headed to Capitol Hill to face the Senate Armed Services Committee. Here's a look at what members had to say and the response.
My impression is you all are doing a good job. We are getting the data that we need. We're getting the support from the Air Force. We're working together with the NRO and other agencies. And as I think many of you or all of you have testified, we're dominant in space right now. I understand the threat, and I understand our adversaries are moving forward, but I don't understand how adding a box to an organizational chart is going to give us some kind of qualitative military edge, to use a term that we've heard in this committee. General Hyten, I'm like the chairman. I'm genuinely undecided, although, as you can tell, I'm skeptical. I don't think it's broken. I think you're doing a good job. Why are we going to fix it?
So, Senator, I think we have been doing a good job. But we've been doing a good job in an environment where space has not been contested. What is changing is we have adversaries that are building significant capabilities that can challenge us in space.
I understand that, but I don't understand how putting a new box in an organizational chart is going to help us to respond to the new challenge that we face.
Well, there's two problems we have to fix. One, we have to have a commander focused on it all the time from an operational perspective. That's the Space Command issue we talked about.
And I agree. I think that's the answer, Frank.
And the second piece, Senator, is we have to have somebody in the Pentagon that focuses their total attention on space all the time. I've known every chief of staff of the Air Force for the last 20 or 30 years, and they've all carried space effectively into the tank. They've all cared about space. But it is a secondary issue, and as they've cared about space in the tank, the Pentagon has built a structure around them with dozens and dozens of people and organizations that are all in charge of space in many ways. I had one chief of staff tell me, well, I won't share the exact words that he told me, but it was very difficult to walk around the Pentagon and not bump into somebody who said they were in charge of space.
To keep up to date with all of our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. Also, be sure to add us on Apple's News app and other platforms for the latest updates. And when we come back, we'll hear from two senior Army leaders about the transformation of the service. Lieutenant General Eric Wesley is helping to lead the transformation of the Army's doctrine and how it fights. At the Global Force Symposium last month, he and Jen Judson talked about what would be needed to change the Army.
So what does it look like to be a multi-domain operations force in 2028? What are we going to see in terms of force structure and equipment and some of the other things that obviously don't get as much attention?
Well, it's important to note that what you'll see in 2028 is a multi-domain operational capable force described in our concept. And what's described in that concept is many things. Among them, as I noted, is the 6 modernization priorities and the 8 CFTs that we've built that has 30 programs of record or so that need to be developed in order to appropriately fight multi-domain operations. So the first thing is, in fact, material acquisition that are described in the 8 CFTs. There will also require some organizational change. After the United States was in a position where we were fairly dominant in the 90s and the first decade of this century, where we largely relied on brigade combat teams and modularity, what we believe is we need to build out echelons above brigade. That's an example of change. Third, we have to have the ability to change our doctrine consistent with what the concept describes. And the doctrine will describe across echelons how you get after the standoff problem. And specifically, what we say is, first you have to compete. We have to get into the competition space. We have to penetrate their long-range fires and their integrated air defense systems. You have to disintegrate those integrated systems and then exploit them to achieve the objectives that you're trying to get after. That's what we describe MDO as. You compete, penetrate, disintegrate, exploit, and then return to competition. All designed to solve the multiple levels of standoff.
Okay. You have a multi-domain operations task force that's been quite busy for several years now. They've been very active in the Pacific. So I'm curious, what their future is. As you better define multi-domain operations, you better refine your doctrine going forward. And doctrine is sort of a living document. It's not, you're not think ever going to potentially be at like a point where you're completely finished writing it, right? So I'm curious, what is sort of the future for the multi-domain operations task force going forward? What do they have left to do that will help feed into some of this initial work?
Right. So first of all, you're absolutely right. Doctrine and concepts continually change as you assess the theater. We stood up the multi-domain task force in the Pacific as a pilot to start experimenting with some of the dynamics of multi-domain operations. And in fact, the multi-domain task force fed and informed the current multi-domain operations concept. So we learned a lot in the Pacific, how you integrate all domains to create overmatch as an example. The multi-domain task force is a near-term pilot that we are employing and using today to learn. I don't imagine that you're going to see the multi-domain task force as it is now in 2028 as an example. Ultimately we won't have single domain organizations. All organizations will be multi-domain. But it was this task force that enabled us to learn what we needed in order to optimize domains to create overmatch.
Is there still work left for them to do then?
Oh, absolutely, because again, 2028 is when we envision we'll have an MDO capable force. Until then, we can bridge the gap and continue to learn as we move in that direction. So I think for the foreseeable future, you're going to see a multi-domain task force that enables both USAPAC and INDOPACOM.
Okay. General Gus Perna leads the Army Materiel Command and is responsible for equipping the Army. But as the Army is changing, his soldiers are having to lead that transformation. Here's a look at part of his interview with Jen Judson.
You disperse equipment globally. Are you rethinking maybe what goes into the Army prepositioned stocks, or where they're located, anything like that that sort of fits more with where the Army is headed in terms of multi-domain?
Great question. And this is also a part of the priority list. It's about being able to project our force anywhere in the world at any time, right? And so you got to think about where you potentially might be, and then you got to work left. And so what we're doing is as you know, we're prepositioning stock, Army prepositioned stocks. We're brigade combat team capable, and that equipment's been positioned around the world. And as we've talked about in the past, we've enabled it so that it's ready to go. The equipment we have positioned forward, a unit flies from installation in the United States, flies over, draws the equipment, and can move to the line of departure and execute mission as directed by the President of the United States. And we can do that in hours. Not days, not months, not years, hours, right? And then you work yourself left, right? You come from the preposition stocks and you make sure that each unit has all the equipment that they're authorized, right? Whether they're active, guard, or reserve. We all have a mandatory list of equipment that the Army's decided is what they need, and it's our responsibility to make sure all that equipment's there. And so what we're doing is we're filling all the holes. We have enough equipment in the Army to fill every unit to over 90%, right? And then the third thing we're doing, based on the Chief's and the Secretary's guidance, as we grow the Army, we're building unit capability. So we're building brigade combat teams, right? We're adding 2 new ones. We're building the new SFABs, the Chief's units that go out and advise and assist, right? We're building new capabilities there. So 3 things: position forward, fill the holes of units that don't have equipment, and build the Army.
In terms of the Army prepositioned stock being equipped for a brigade combat team, and General Wesley has discussed how potentially the Army will sort of be looking at its force structure entirely, and we could see some changes, and maybe the future it's not so brigade combat team centric. So what are you doing to take a look at what you have in terms of Army prepositioned stock, or how you disperse equipment? Are you looking at making major changes that basically complement what will be done with the force structure?
We're working that. The Army is taking that on, and they're working with the Department of Defense. Right? It's a capability that the Army is responsible for, but the Secretary of Defense will finally determine the final strategy. We're making recommendations not only on what capability do you want, where do you want it positioned, how do you want it manned, and how much access in time and availability do you want to all the sets. So we're working through that process now in conjunction, as General Wesley said, as they think about what they need today versus the future, and how do we scale accordingly. And as earlier mentioned, it potentially could be a joint capability as we go forward.
Okay. So, obviously, you have a lot to focus on globally, but in terms of policy, we're looking at potentially divesting lots of equipment, and also currently you're sustaining equipment that may need to be divested. And it seems like it comes at a good point because that would free up some funding in order to fund some of the modernization priorities. So can you talk a little bit about maybe what you're doing to make it easier to divest some of the systems that you're currently sustaining that costs a pretty penny to keep sustained when you're not really using it?
So great question. Over the years, we've had equipment that have been standard, and because of the war, we've added equipment to help us fight our enemy, and we continually to modernize and progress our equipment accordingly to the enemy, to fight the enemy. As we do that, we determine there's equipment that is no longer needed, right? And that we can divest of that. That's very, very simple to see. The Army can see for the first time in my real career, and I've talked about this with you before, we can see every piece of equipment and where it's at. We know what is mandatory and we know what is excess. So immediately we can eliminate that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The second thing we're doing is we are managing the fielding of equipment, right? So as new things come in, we're taking an Army perspective to prioritize and execute the fielding to make sure that the equipment comes completely in a set, soldiers are trained, and then simultaneously we're reducing the excess, the old equipment, so it doesn't become a burden to them. Now, your question directly said, how are you going about doing that? So what we're doing is we're coordinating with the forces, right? Forces Command, USERA, USERPAC, are sent, and we're establishing time periods. The commander determines the time period, and it says, hey, I'm gonna block this week or these 2 weeks or this month. If you could enable us with support, I'll make sure all the equipment that you identify gets turned in. We'll go through containers, motor pools, offices, headquarters, and we'll bring it all to you, and we'll let you take it out. And what's great about that is we can bring the power of the enterprise to that, right? We take the logistics readiness centers, we open them up 24/7. We're bringing in a Defense Logistics Agency who's a huge partner with us. They come in and do disposal. We can sell some things, to local industry and communities as required. We turn things around as excess defense articles, and we process them for support to other countries if they want it. And then the third thing we do is we just destroy it, right? But the objective is to get it out of the commander's responsibilities so they can focus on their equipment that they need. They can maintain their equipment, not two pieces of equipment.
When we come back, we'll visit a very special bar outside Fort Bragg and pay tribute to an Air Force legend. On this week's Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union's Jeanette Mack offers her latest tips.
Nearly 250,000 service members transition out of the military every year, according to the DoD. Transitioning means making decisions and perhaps finding a new path. If it's a new career or a new place to live, be sure to use the resources at your fingertips. Right now, the economy is booming. Areas around the country are seeing rapid growth, creating new opportunities for veterans. The question just becomes, what kind of life do you want to live? Do you want to see the city lights or stars in the night sky? Are good school districts a priority, or is affordable housing? These are important questions to ask yourself and your loved ones. One resource from Navy Federal includes a list of the top cities for transitioning service members. The list takes into account the cost of living, veteran-friendly employers, and the overall quality of life. The military offers a variety of transitioning programs, from resume writing to building your own business. Programs like the Transition Assistance Program, or TAP, provide information and tools to help you find training and available jobs throughout the country. Transitioning to civilian life is certainly not easy, but with a little preparation and a little assistance, you too can lead the life you want.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more defense news coverage, be sure to visit our website at defensenews.com and subscribe to our Early Bird Brief, delivered to your inbox every weekday morning to get you ready to start the day. And when we come back, we'll visit a special bar outside Fort Bragg and pay tribute to an Air Force legend. Charlie Mike's is a special forces bar located just outside of Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Recently, our counterparts at Military Times got a chance to visit and experience the bar. Here's what they saw.
If I randomly flick people off, you're going to have to cut that out because I'm going to flick my boss off. Deal with that? Yeah. I'm going to get him. All right, so Charlie Mike's. It's like a military version of Cheers. And you have the wall behind me, of course. So these are the ones that died in combat on this wall. It goes from 9/11 and it goes down all the way to the most recent down there. I mean, the people that come in here, especially if you're a regular here or you come in here a lot, you have someone on that wall you know. On the day of all these men's deaths, so we take them down and we put them at the front of the bar for the whole day and read their bio. We'll let people talk if they want to, and then we'll play the Ballad of the Green Beret.
We have a tradition here at Charlie Mike's. We like to honor our fallen. Today we're going to honor a brother that was lost on 22 January of 2019.
He was probably one of the best guys you could ever meet. Did everything for us. Saved a lot of our lives on this trip. Unfortunately, we lost him, so I'm going to do a team toast for us. Love you, Wobble.
Fighting soldiers from the sky, fearless men who jump and die, men who mean just what they say, the brave men.
My name is Robert Hash. I'm the owner of Charlie Mike's Pub. Charlie Mike's, phonetic spelling, continue mission. So Charlie Mike's, that's where the name Charlie Mike's comes from. If you were out doing a patrol or something and they wanted you, your commander wanted you to continue the mission, they would tell you Charlie Mike over the radio. Our mission statement is we're a corner pub, local corner pub for everybody that wants to come in. There's a lot of SF guys that come in here, sure, but I would say right now half the people in here are not Special Forces affiliated whatsoever. Some of the memorials that we do here for friends of mine, people I knew personally, those are always very emotional events, very, real tear-jerkers and their families. There's actually some Gold Star wives in here tonight that are running around in here, that their husbands are on the wall. And so it's always emotional. None of these guys on the wall, if they knew that eventually they'd end up on the wall, they would still do what they were doing. They wouldn't change it at all. So.
This week, the U.S. Air Force lost one of its legends, Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cole, the last of the Doolittle Raiders, who bombed Tokyo during the dark days of early 1942. Colonel Cole was a hero to me and many others, and will be deeply missed. But his legacy will not fade. I'll leave you with what Air Force Chief of Staff General David Goldfein told Space Symposium attendees just after learning of Colonel Cole's passing.
Sadly, just before taking the stage, I took a call from his son, Rich, who shared that there's another hole in our formation. And our last remaining Doolittle Raider has slipped the surly bonds of earth and is now reunited with his fellow Raiders. And what a reunion they must be having. We all know Colonel Cole as Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot of the first aircraft that launched off the USS Hornet on the famed Doolittle raid on the 18th of April, 1942, 77 years ago this Saturday. Those 80 intrepid airmen changed the course of history as they executed a one-way mission without hesitation against enormous odds. And 2 years ago, when we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the raid at our Air Force Museum, I asked Colonel Cole what it felt like to be flying blind for so many hours, low on gas, after they'd hit their targets trying to make it to the Chinese coastline without a beacon to guide them. And he offered, "Well, General, it sure would have been nice to have had GPS back then." You know, we're going to miss Colonel Cole, and we offer our eternal thanks and our condolences to his family.
That's all we have time for this week, but if you want to see and read more, be sure to head over to defensenews.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.